Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. There was an old hotel in the heart of the city, long past its prime but still standing. The Riverview Inn, once a glamorous destination for wealthy travelers, had become a crumbling relic of its former self. Its grandeur had faded, leaving behind creaking floors, dim lighting, and a lingering scent of dampness that clung to every corner. Despite its decline, people still stayed at the Riverview Inn. Businessmen who couldn't find a room elsewhere, curious tourists drawn by its history, and the occasional drifter looking for a cheap night's rest. Most who stayed at the inn never noticed anything strange, but those who were unlucky enough to be assigned room 614 never checked out. The first reported disappearance happened 50 years ago. A traveling salesman named Elliot Graham had checked into room 614 for the night. He had an appointment in the city the next morning but never showed up. When his colleagues went to the hotel to inquire, the manager claimed Elliot had left early in the morning without a word. His belongings were gone, and there was no sign of him. A week later, his car was found abandoned miles away, but Elliot himself was never seen again. His disappearance remained a mystery, whispered about in hushed tones by the locals. Over time, the story faded into legend, but Elliot was only the first. Others who stayed in room 614 over the years met a similar fate. Each time, the pattern was the same. They checked in, but they never checked out. As the disappearances continued, rumors began to spread about room 614. Some said the room was cursed, others believed it was haunted by a restless spirit. The hotel staff refused to talk about it, dismissing the claims as nonsense. But behind closed doors, they were just as frightened as the guests. They knew something was wrong with that room, though none dared enter it after dark. In an attempt to quell the rumors, the management tried to close off room 614. They locked the door, nailed it shut, and even tried sealing it with bricks, but nothing worked. The next morning, the door would always be back in place, unlocked and inviting, as if daring someone to step inside. Despite their fear, the hotel couldn't afford to lose business. Eventually, they stopped trying to block off the room and simply assigned it sparingly, always to guests who seemed unlikely to cause a fuss if something went wrong. One rainy evening, a young woman named Clara Evans arrived at the Riverview Inn. She was a writer, traveling to the city for inspiration and research on her next book. When she approached the front desk, the clerk hesitated before handing her the key to room 614. "Are you sure you want this room?" the clerk asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't I? Is there something wrong with it?" The clerk forced a smile. "No, ma'am, just... some people find it a bit drafty." Clara shrugged. "I'll be fine. It's just for one night." The clerk handed her the key, his hands trembling slightly. "Good luck," he muttered under his breath as she walked away. Room 614 was ordinary at first glance. Faded wallpaper covered the walls, and an old-fashioned lamp cast a dim glow across the room. The bed looked clean, and a large window overlooked the rainy streets below. Clara set down her suitcase and unpacked, ignoring the slight chill in the air. As the evening wore on, she noticed strange things. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and she heard faint whispers, though she was sure she was alone. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, a result of fatigue in the storm outside. But then the door slammed shut on its own. Clara rushed to the door, trying to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. She twisted and pulled with all her strength, but it was as if the door was fused to the frame. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, forming words Clara could barely understand. A cold wind blew through the room, despite the windows being closed. Then, in the dim light of the lamp, a figure appeared. A translucent woman dressed in a tattered 1920s gown, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, backing away. The spirit didn't answer immediately. Instead, she floated closer, her expression both sad and menacing. "No one ever leaves," the ghost said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You're mine now." Clara's heart raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Please, I don't want any trouble. Just let me go. The ghost's expression twisted into a grimace. I was promised eternity. They left me here, alone, forgotten. Now everyone who enters must stay with me. Forever. Clara refused to accept her fate. She searched the room for anything that could help her escape. She found nothing but old furniture and peeling wallpaper. The window was locked tight, and even if she could open it, she was several floors up with no way down. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her from all sides. Shadows flickered on the walls, taking on grotesque shapes. Clara tried to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the ghostly cacophony. In a last-ditch effort, she grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and a rush of cold air flooded the room. Without thinking, Clara climbed onto the ledge and jumped, bracing herself for impact. Clara woke up in a hospital bed, her body bruised but miraculously intact. A nurse stood by her side, looking concerned. "You're lucky to be alive," the nurse said. "They found you unconscious outside the Riverview Inn. How did you fall from that height?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain what had happened in room 614. All she knew was that she had escaped, but at a cost. The next day, the Riverview Inn was cordoned off by the authorities. Rumors spread about the strange occurrences, and the hotel was finally shut down for good. But those who passed by the old building at night still claimed to hear whispers coming from within, and sometimes, if you look closely at the windows, you can see the figure of a woman in a tattered gown, waiting for her next guest. They say room 614 is still there, waiting, and once you enter, you can never leave. In a forgotten corner of the countryside, surrounded by dense woods and shrouded in perpetual mist, stood Sonata Manor, an ancient estate long abandoned. For decades, locals whispered about the place, a mansion with a tragic history where music could be heard late at night, though no one had lived there for years. The source of the music? A grand piano in the parlor that played on its own. Many believed the piano was cursed, linked to the tormented soul of Eleanor Whitmore, the last known resident of the manor. Eleanor had been a gifted pianist, renowned for her hauntingly beautiful compositions, but her life had ended tragically under mysterious circumstances, leaving the piano behind, forever imbued with her sorrow. Eleanor had inherited Sonata Manor from her father, a stern and distant man who never understood her love for music. He had insisted she marry a wealthy suitor to secure the family's fortune, but Eleanor defied him. She chose instead to pursue her passion, devoting herself entirely to her piano. In her final years, Eleanor composed a piece she called Requiem of Shadows. It was said to be the most beautiful and sorrowful melody ever written, but no one had ever heard it performed. On the night she intended to debut the piece, a terrible fire engulfed the manor. Eleanor was trapped inside, and her body was never found. After the fire, the manor was rebuilt, but no one dared live there. Strange occurrences began, shadows moving without cause, whispers in the night, and the piano playing faintly by itself. Over time, the locals grew fearful, and the estate was left to decay. Years later, a young musician named Daniel Harper arrived in the nearby village. He had heard the stories of Sonata Manor and the haunted piano. Driven by curiosity and a deep love of music, he decided to investigate. Daniel was an aspiring composer, struggling to create something original. He hoped the legend of Eleanor and her mysterious final piece might inspire him. "Are you sure you want to go there?" asked an elderly villager when Daniel inquired about the manor. "No one who spends the night at Sonata Manor comes back the same." "I'll be fine," Daniel said confidently. "I don't believe in ghosts." Despite the warnings, he set out toward the manor at dusk, carrying only a lantern and a notebook. As Daniel approached the manor, an eerie silence fell over the woods. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Sonata Manor loomed before him, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and decay. The windows, cracked and broken, reflected the dying light like hollow eyes. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Daniel stepped inside. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the chandeliers like tattered curtains. But it was the grand piano in the parlor that caught his attention. A magnificent instrument, untouched by time, its black surface gleaming in the dim light. As he approached, a chill ran down his spine. The piano keys moved slightly, as if touched by invisible hands. Then, without warning, it began to play. The melody was haunting, melancholic yet captivating. Daniel froze, unable to look away as the notes filled the room. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, and yet it felt familiar, as though it spoke directly to his soul. Slowly, he reached out and placed his fingers on the keys, joining in with the ghostly music. To his surprise, the piano responded, guiding his hands as if it had a will of its own. He played for hours, lost in the music, until exhaustion overcame him. He fell asleep on a nearby sofa, lulled by the piano's mournful tune. In the middle of the night, Daniel awoke to a whisper. He sat up, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing by the piano, a woman in a flowing white gown, her face pale and ethereal. Her fingers danced across the keys, though they made no sound. "Eleanor," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. The ghostly figure turned to him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Finish it," she said, her voice echoing as though carried by the wind. "Finish the requiem." Before Daniel could respond, she vanished, leaving only the cold air and an unfinished melody lingering in his mind. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel spent the following days exploring the manor and learning more about Eleanor's life. He found old letters, sheet music, and diary entries hidden in the library. They revealed Eleanor's struggle, her defiance of her father, her isolation, and her obsession with composing the perfect piece. But the final pages of her diary were missing, as was the complete score for Requiem of Shadows. It was clear to Daniel that Eleanor had died before finishing it, and now her spirit was trapped, unable to move on until the piece was completed. Night after night, Daniel returned to the piano, playing alongside the ghostly presence. Each time Eleanor appeared, guiding him through the notes she had left unfinished. Slowly, the melody took shape, growing darker and more beautiful with each passing night. But as the requiem neared completion, strange things began to happen. Shadows crept closer, the temperature plummeted, and whispers filled the air. It was as if the very house was awakening, and something far more sinister lurked within. On the final night, as Daniel prepared to play the last movement, the room grew deathly cold. The shadows gathered around him, forming a menacing presence. Eleanor's ghost appeared once more, her face filled with urgency. "Hurry," she whispered. "Finish it before they come." With trembling hands, Daniel played the final notes of the requiem. As the last chord echoed through the room, a blinding light filled the manor. The shadows shrieked and dissolved into nothingness, and Eleanor's spirit began to fade. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. "I am free." With that, she vanished, leaving Daniel alone in the silent manor. Daniel returned to the village, forever changed by his experience. He completed Eleanor's requiem and published it under her name, ensuring her legacy would live on. The piece became famous, hailed as one of the most hauntingly beautiful compositions ever written. As for Sonata Manor, it remained abandoned, but the music was never heard again. Some say the curse was broken, while others believe Eleanor's spirit still lingers, watching over her beloved piano. But one thing was certain: no one dared enter Sonata Manor again, for fear that the cursed keys might begin to play once more. In the quiet town of Asheville, there was an old abandoned railway station on the outskirts that locals referred to as Black Hollow Station. Rusting tracks wound through dense, overgrown woods, leading nowhere, or so it seemed. For decades, stories were told about a train that only appeared at midnight, a train that carried passengers on a one-way journey to the afterlife. Few believed the tales, dismissing them as nothing more than local folklore meant to scare children and curious outsiders. But those who had lived in Asheville long enough knew the truth. People who went to Black Hollow Station at night never returned. According to the legend, the train had first appeared over 100 years ago, shortly after a tragic accident claimed the lives of dozens of passengers. The train had been en route to the next town when it derailed near a steep cliff, plunging into the river below. No survivors were ever found, and the wreckage was never recovered. In the years that followed, sightings of the ghostly train began. Locals reported hearing the distant whistle of a locomotive, even though no trains ran on the old tracks anymore. Some claimed to see a spectral light moving through the woods, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. The most chilling part of the story was that the train didn't just haunt the tracks, it beckoned to those who had unfinished business with death. One fateful evening, A group of friends gathered at the local diner, discussing the legend. Among them was Ethan, a skeptical young man who had always been fascinated by the paranormal, but had never witnessed anything himself. "It's just an old ghost story," Ethan said, laughing. "There's no such thing as a train to the afterlife." "Then why don't you prove it?" challenged Lila, one of his friends. "Go to Black Hollow Station tonight. If you're right, you'll come back with nothing but a boring story. And if you're wrong," added Max, "well, we'll know, won't we?" Ethan grinned, unwilling to back down from a dare. "Fine. Midnight, Black Hollow Station. I'll be back before you know it." As the clock struck 11, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the old railway station. The night was cold, and a dense fog had settled over the town. The path to Black Hollow Station was overgrown and eerie, lined with gnarled trees whose branches stretched out like skeletal arms. When he finally arrived, he found the station in ruins. The platform was cracked and covered in moss, and the wooden benches were rotted and splintered. A broken sign swung lazily in the wind, creaking ominously. "Looks like nothing's been here for years," Ethan muttered to himself, shining his flashlight over the tracks. He checked his watch. 11:55 p.m. Just as the clock struck midnight, a distant whistle echoed through the night. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels. Through the fog, a faint light appeared, steadily approaching the station. Within moments, a ghostly train emerged from the darkness. Its exterior shimmered like mist, and its windows glowed with an eerie, pale light. The engine hissed as it came to a stop, and the doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to run, but curiosity kept him rooted in place. Gathering his courage, he stepped onto the platform and peered inside. The interior was filled with passengers, silent, spectral figures who stared ahead with vacant eyes. Before he could react, a voice echoed from the train. "All aboard! Final destination! Eternity!" Compelled by an unseen force, Ethan stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind him, and the whistle blew once more. The train began to move, gliding smoothly along the tracks. Ethan walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. None of the passengers acknowledged him. They sat motionless, as if unaware of his presence. At the end of the car, he found an empty seat and sat down, his mind racing with questions. Suddenly, a conductor appeared, a tall, thin figure dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. His face was pale and expressionless, and his eyes glowed faintly. "Your ticket, sir," the conductor said, holding out a skeletal hand. I don't have a ticket," Ethan stammered. The conductor tilted his head as if considering something. "No ticket is required for those who seek passage willingly. But beware, this train only travels one way." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Where are we going?" "To the land of the forgotten," the conductor replied, "where souls find their final rest, or remain lost forever." As the train continued its journey, Ethan looked out the window. The scenery outside had changed. No longer the familiar woods of Asheville, but a barren, desolate landscape shrouded in mist. He could see shadowy figures wandering aimlessly, their faces obscured. A sense of dread settled over him. He realized that he might never return home, that this might truly be a journey to the afterlife. But before panic could set in, the train slowed to a stop. The conductor reappeared, his expression grave. "You do not belong here," he said. "You were brought by curiosity, not by fate. Leave now while you still can." The doors opened, revealing a dense fog beyond the platform. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what lay ahead. "If you remain, you will become one of us," the conductor warned. "Trapped between worlds, forever riding the train." Without another word, Ethan stepped off the train. The doors closed behind him, and the train began to move once more, vanishing into the mist. Ethan found himself back at Black Hollow Station, the familiar woods of Asheville surrounding him once again. He checked his watch. It was exactly midnight. No time had passed since he boarded the train. Ethan returned to the diner, shaken but alive. He told his friends what had happened, but few believed him. Those who did knew that he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. In the years that followed, Ethan never returned to Black Hollow Station, but on cold, foggy nights he could still hear the distant whistle of the ghostly train, reminding him of the journey he would never forget. And so, The legend of the midnight train to eternity lived on, a chilling tale whispered by those who dared to listen. It began on a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily Carter, a freelance photographer, stumbled upon a forgotten antique shop at the edge of town. She had been wandering aimlessly, searching for inspiration for her next project, when she noticed the sign, "Hollow Frames and Oddities." The wooden sign creaked in the wind, and the dimly lit windows gave the shop an air of mystery. Inside, the shop was cluttered with ancient trinkets, dusty books, and cracked porcelain dolls. Emily browsed through the aisles, her fingers brushing over the worn surfaces of old frames. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but something about the place made her linger. As she turned a corner, her eyes fell upon a peculiar photograph in an ornate silver frame. It depicted a serene countryside, a lone oak tree standing atop a grassy hill, beneath a sky filled with rolling gray clouds. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the image, something that stirred an inexplicable feeling deep within her. "Interested in that one?" The shopkeeper's voice startled her. He was an elderly man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. "Strange piece, that is. Been here as long as I can remember." Emily hesitated. "What's strange about it?" The shopkeeper leaned in, his voice low. "It changes. Every time someone looks at it, the image shifts. People say it's cursed, but I don't put much stock in that." He chuckled softly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Take it if you want. No charge. Just don't bring it back." Curiosity got the better of her. Emily took the photograph home, dismissing the man's ominous tone as little more than theatrics meant to intrigue buyers. Back in her apartment, Emily placed the photograph on her desk and sat down to study it. The oak tree still stood atop the hill, but something was different. The clouds in the sky seemed darker, heavier, as if a storm was brewing. She blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but when she looked again, the photograph appeared unchanged. Shrugging off the strange sensation, she went about her evening. As a photographer, she was accustomed to studying images closely, and she figured her imagination had simply run wild. However, when she returned to her desk an hour later, her breath caught in her throat. The photograph had changed. The oak tree was now bare, its branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The once lush grass was dry and brittle, and the clouds had thickened, casting an eerie gloom over the scene. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. How was this possible? Grabbing her camera, she snapped a picture of the photograph, intending to compare it later. She stared at the image for a few more moments, half expecting it to shift again, but nothing happened. Feeling a bit foolish, she chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed. Over the next few days, Emily became increasingly obsessed with the photograph. Every time she glanced at it, something was different. At first, the changes were subtle. The sky grew darker, the grass withered further, but soon more sinister elements began to appear. One evening, she noticed a figure standing beneath the oak tree. It was little more than a shadow at first, indistinct and far away, but each time she looked, the figure grew clearer. By the end of the week, it was unmistakably a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching her, even though his head never moved. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her work, but the photograph demanded her attention. It was as if it had a life of its own, a presence that grew stronger with each passing day. Desperate for an explanation, Emily returned to the antique shop, but it was gone. In its place was an empty, boarded-up building with no sign of ever having been a shop. Frustrated and frightened, she turned to research. She scoured the internet, hoping to find some mention of a cursed photograph, but found nothing. One night, as she sat in front of her computer, she decided to confront her fear head-on. She grabbed the photograph and stared at it, determined to catch it in the act of changing. The figure beneath the tree was still there, but something new had appeared. A second figure, smaller and more distinct. It was a woman, her face pale and sorrowful. As Emily watched in horrified fascination, the figures began to move. Slowly, they turned to face each other, their heads tilting as if in conversation. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man began to raise his hand toward the woman. Emily's chest tightened. She couldn't look away. Suddenly, the room grew cold. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and an oppressive silence filled the air. The photograph shimmered, and for a brief moment, she saw her own reflection in the glass. But it wasn't just her. Standing behind her was the man in the dark coat. With a scream, she spun around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the photograph, it had changed again. Now the woman lay on the ground beneath the tree, her form blurred as if fading away. Terrified and convinced that the photograph was more than just an object, Emily decided to destroy it. She grabbed a hammer and struck the frame, shattering the glass. But instead of feeling relief, she felt an intense wave of nausea. The photograph, though cracked, remained intact, and the figures now stared directly at her. Panicking, she remembered the shopkeeper's words, "Don't bring it back." But if she couldn't destroy it, what could she do? That night she dreamt of the oak tree, the figures standing beneath it, and a whispering voice that urged her to return the photograph to where it belonged. The next morning, Emily packed the photograph and drove out to the countryside. She followed the winding roads until she found a hill that looked eerily familiar. At its peak stood an ancient oak tree, its branches bare and twisted. With trembling hands, she placed the photograph at the base of the tree. The wind picked up, carrying with it a whisper she couldn't understand. As she stepped back, the photograph shimmered one last time before disintegrating into ash. Emily never saw the photograph again, but the experience left a mark on her. She never returned to the countryside, nor did she ever speak of what had happened. However, she often felt as though she was being watched, as though the figures in the photograph were still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, she could still hear the wind whispering secrets from the past, carrying with it the echo of a curse that had never truly been broken. For generations, the Devereux family prided itself on its wealth, power, and prestige. Their estate, an expansive Gothic mansion in the heart of the English countryside, was a symbol of their legacy. But behind the grandeur of their name lay a dark secret, a curse tied to a certain family heirloom. The heirloom in question was an ornate silver-handled dagger, encased in glass and displayed prominently in the Devereux family's private gallery. It was said to have belonged to Ambrose Devereux, a 17th century ancestor known for his ruthless nature and insatiable thirst for power. According to family legend, Ambrose had acquired the dagger during a campaign in an unnamed foreign land. He claimed it was forged by an ancient order that imbued their weapons with mystical power. However, what Ambrose didn't know was that the dagger carried with it a curse, one that would plague his bloodline for centuries to come. The first recorded instance of the curse appeared shortly after Ambrose's mysterious death. His son, Edwin Devereux, inherited the estate and the dagger. Within a year, Edwin was found dead in his study, the same dagger clutched tightly in his hand. Though his death was ruled a suicide, whispers of something far more sinister spread among the servants and townsfolk. Over the years, every Devereux heir who came into possession of the dagger met a similarly tragic end. Some went mad, others died in freak accidents, and a few vanished without a trace. Despite this, the family refused to part with the dagger, believing it to be a symbol of their lineage, one they were bound to protect at all costs. By the early 21st century, the Devereux estate had fallen into disrepair. The once great family was now reduced to Evelyn Devereux, the last living descendant. Evelyn was a historian, deeply skeptical of the supernatural stories surrounding her family. She had inherited the estate after her father's untimely death, though she rarely visited the crumbling mansion. However, when she received a letter from the family solicitor urging her to settle the estate's affairs, she reluctantly agreed to return. Accompanied by her childhood friend Daniel, a fellow historian and skeptic, Evelyn arrived at the mansion on a stormy evening. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, and the creaking floorboards echoed ominously as they made their way inside. Evelyn's goal was simple: document the estate's contents, sell what she could, and finally rid herself of the cursed legacy. While sorting through the gallery, Evelyn's eyes fell upon the glass case containing the dagger. She had seen it many times as a child, but had never dared touch it. Now, with Daniel by her side, she felt a strange compulsion to examine it more closely. As she opened the case, a chill swept through the room. Daniel, noticing her hesitation, joked, Maybe the curse doesn't like being disturbed. Evelyn rolled her eyes but couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. She picked up the dagger, its silver handle cold and unusually heavy in her hand. "That's strange," she murmured. "It feels warm now." Before Daniel could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. The storm outside intensified, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. When the lights flickered back on, Evelyn gasped. The walls of the gallery were now adorned with portraits of long-dead Devereaux ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel whispered, his voice tinged with fear. Over the next few days, Evelyn experienced vivid dreams of Ambrose Devereaux. In these dreams, he stood at the edge of a battlefield, the dagger gleaming in his hand. Each night, the dreams grew darker, filled with images of blood and betrayal. She began to hear whispers in the halls of the mansion, whispers that called her name and urged her to embrace her destiny. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn delved into the family archives. Hidden among old ledgers and letters, she discovered a tattered journal belonging to Ambrose. Its final entry read, "To those who come after me, beware the dagger. It is both a boon and a curse. It grants power, but at a terrible price. I tried to break its hold, but failed. Now it binds itself to my bloodline, feeding on our despair. Only by returning it to its origin can the curse be undone." Evelyn and Daniel pieced together the clues. The dagger's origin lay in a distant, forgotten land, and unless it was returned, the Devereaux family would remain cursed forever. Evelyn and Daniel embarked on a perilous journey, tracing the dagger's origins to a remote region in Eastern Europe. They met with local historians who spoke of an ancient order that forged weapons to guard against malevolent forces. According to legend, if such a weapon was stolen or misused, it would bind itself to the thief's bloodline until it was willingly returned to the sacred grounds from which it came. Their quest led them deep into a mountainous forest where they finally discovered a crumbling temple. As they approached the altar at the heart of the temple, the air grew thick and shadows danced along the walls. Evelyn placed the dagger on the altar, and for a moment, everything was still. Then a blinding light engulfed the room, and the oppressive energy lifted. When Evelyn and Daniel returned to the Devereaux estate, it was as if a weight had been lifted. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the portraits in the gallery now seemed serene rather than menacing. Evelyn knew the curse had been broken. She sold the estate soon after, choosing to leave behind the dark legacy of her ancestors. Though the memories of her experience would remain, she finally felt free. As for the dagger, it was never seen again. Some say it remains hidden in the temple, waiting for another soul to disturb its rest. But Evelyn knew one thing for certain: her family's curse had finally come to an end. And with it, so had the long, dark shadow that had haunted the Devereaux name for centuries. In the heart of Willow's Hollow, a dense and ancient forest that stretched far beyond the horizon, there stood a peculiar tree. It was unlike any other in the forest, with bark as dark as midnight and twisted branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the Wailing Tree, for those who ventured too close swore they heard faint cries emanating from its trunk. Despite its ominous reputation, curiosity had always drawn people to it, people who were never the same afterward. It began centuries ago when Alara Woodcroft, a healer from the village, sought refuge in the forest after being accused of witchcraft. Desperate and alone, she stumbled upon the dark tree. Exhausted, she leaned against its bark, and as soon as she touched it, an icy chill ran through her body. That night, Alara vanished without a trace. But soon after, villagers reported seeing her ghost wandering near the tree, her eyes hollow, her lips whispering curses into the wind. From that day forward, the villagers avoided the tree, warning their children never to approach it. But over time, the warnings turned into mere superstition, and curiosity always found new victims. Many years later, a group of friends, Liam, Sophie, Darren, and Emily, decided to explore Willow's Hollow. They had heard the old stories about the cursed tree, but none of them believed in ghosts or curses. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they set out on a chilly autumn evening, determined to find the infamous Wailing Tree. "Come on, it's just an old legend," Darren said, trying to mask his unease. "Probably just some weird-looking tree with a spooky name." It's still creepy, Sophie muttered, hugging her jacket tighter. After an hour of trekking through the dense forest, they finally found it. The tree loomed before them, larger and darker than they had imagined. The air around it felt colder, and a strange silence enveloped the clearing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. Liam, always the bravest of the group, walked up to the tree. "Looks normal to me," he said, placing his hand on the rough bark. "Don't touch it," Sophie hissed, but it was too late. The moment Liam's hand made contact, a chill shot through the air, and an eerie whisper echoed through the clearing. He jerked his hand back, shivering. "Did you hear that?" "Let's get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. The group hurried back to the village, but none of them could shake the feeling that something was wrong. Liam laughed it off, pretending he wasn't rattled, but that night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tree, and worse, he felt as though someone, or something, was watching him. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Liam noticed shadows moving in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, nothing was there. He began hearing faint whispers whenever he was alone, whispers that grew louder at night. Sophie, Emily, and Darren experienced similar disturbances. Sophie swore she saw a figure standing outside her window one night, while Emily found strange, cold handprints on her bedroom wall. By the end of the week, all four friends were plagued by the same nightmare. A vision of Lara Woodcroft standing beneath the cursed tree, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, her voice whispering, "You touched what should not be touched. Now I follow." Desperate for answers, they sought out old Marlowe, the village's historian. He lived in a small cottage on the edge of Willow's Hollow and was known for his knowledge of the forest's dark past. "You touched the wailing tree?" Marlowe asked, his eyes widening in alarm when they told him what had happened. "Fools! That tree is cursed. Those who touch it are marked by the spirit bound to it, Lara Woodcroft. She follows the marked, haunting them until—" He trailed off, his expression grim. "Until what?" Liam demanded. "Until they either succumb to madness or find a way to lift the curse," Marlowe said. "Lara's spirit is trapped by the tree, but it clings to those who disturb her. To break the curse, you must return to the tree and offer something precious to appease her spirit." "What kind of offering?" Sophie asked nervously. "Something that holds great meaning to you," Marlowe replied. "A personal sacrifice." That night, the four friends returned to the forest, carrying with them items of personal significance. Liam brought a locket given to him by his late grandmother. Sophie brought her childhood diary. Darren brought a watch his father had given him, and Emily brought a bracelet from her mother. As they approached the tree, the air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. Shadows danced around them, and the faint outline of a woman appeared beneath the tree's twisted branches. "Lara," Liam whispered. Following Marlowe's instructions, they placed their offerings at the base of the tree. The ghostly figure of Lara stepped forward, her hollow eyes fixed on them. For a moment, all was silent. Then a chilling wind swept through the clearing, and the items vanished into the earth. The figure of Lara faded, and with it, the oppressive presence lifted. The air grew warmer, and the whispers ceased. The curse had been broken. The four friends never spoke of that night again. Though they returned to their normal lives, they could never forget the haunting experience in Willow's Hollow. The tree remained in the forest, dark and twisted, but no one dared to approach it again. Some say that Lara's spirit had finally found peace, but others believe that the curse merely waits for the next unwary traveler to awaken it. The wailing tree stands as a silent sentinel in the heart of the forest, its dark branches forever reaching, forever waiting. And so, the legend of the cursed tree lived on, a chilling tale whispered by the villagers of Willow's Hollow for generations to come. There was a river that wound through the heart of Greystone Hollow, a small village hidden in the valley between two mountains. Known as the Murkwater, it shimmered eerily in the sunlight, its surface always calm yet uninviting. The river's dark reputation had earned it many whispered names: the Drowning River, the Whispering Depths, and most chilling of all, the River of Lost Souls. Legends passed down through generations warned villagers never to swim in its waters. Those who did were never seen again, vanishing beneath the surface without so much as a ripple to mark their passing. Despite the warnings, There were always a few who dared to challenge the river's sinister reputation. Some believed it was nothing more than a village superstition, while others were lured by the river's strange beauty. Long ago, before Greystone Hollow was a thriving village, the river had been a lifeline for the people who lived there. Its waters were clear and its currents gentle. According to ancient stories, the river was home to a benevolent spirit, a guardian who blessed the land and its people with bountiful harvests and pure water. But everything changed when outsiders came to the valley, bringing greed and violence with them. They sought to control the river, building dams and polluting its waters in their quest for wealth. The guardian spirit, heartbroken and enraged by the desecration of her home, withdrew deep into the river's depths. Her sorrow turned to wrath, and she cursed the waters. From that day on, anyone who entered the river would be pulled under by unseen hands, never to resurface. As time passed, the legend grew, and the villagers learned to fear the murk water. They built their homes far from its banks, and only ventured near it to draw water or fish from its edge. Even then, they always stayed vigilant, wary of the river's haunting pull. One summer evening, a group of local teenagers gathered near the riverbank. Among them was Ethan, a brash and headstrong boy known for his reckless dares, and Lena, his childhood friend who often tried to talk him out of trouble. The others included Mark, Claire, and Sam, who followed Ethan's lead more out of fear of being ridiculed than genuine bravery. "You're all scared of a stupid story," Ethan taunted, skipping a stone across the water's glassy surface. "It's just a river. Nothing's going to happen if we go in." "You're crazy, Ethan," Lena said, crossing her arms. "You know what they say about the river. People disappear." "Stories to keep kids from having fun," Ethan scoffed. "Watch this." Before anyone could stop him, he stripped off his shirt and waded into the water. The river felt colder than he expected, sending a chill through his bones. But he wasn't about to back down in front of his friends. He swam a few strokes out, grinning back at them. "See? I'm fine," he called, splashing the water playfully. Suddenly, the air grew unnaturally still, and a faint whispering sound filled the clearing. Lena's heart raced as she strained to hear the words, but they were too faint to understand. "Ethan, come back!" she shouted, her voice trembling. But Ethan didn't respond. His grin faded as something brushed against his leg beneath the water. He kicked, thinking it was just a stray branch or a fish. But the touch returned, firmer this time, as if a hand had gripped his ankle. "Guys, something's down here," Ethan yelled, panic creeping into his voice. He tried to swim back, but he couldn't move. It was as though invisible hands were pulling him deeper. The others watched in horror as Ethan struggled, his arms flailing wildly. Before anyone could react, he was yanked beneath the surface. A single ripple marked the spot where he vanished. "Ethan!" Lena screamed, rushing to the river's edge. The water was eerily calm, reflecting the darkening sky above. There was no sign of Ethan, no splash, no bubbles, just silence. The group ran back to the village, breathless and terrified. They told the villagers what had happened, but there was little anyone could do. Search parties scoured the riverbanks, but no trace of Ethan was ever found. The villagers mourned his loss, though many weren't surprised. To them, it was just another reminder of the river's curse. Lena, however, couldn't accept it. She was haunted by guilt, feeling that she should have done more to stop Ethan. Night after night, she dreamed of the river and heard faint whispers calling her name. The voice sounded familiar, as if it belonged to Ethan. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, Lena sought out old Miriam, the village's wise woman who knew more about the river's curse than anyone else. Miriam lived in a small cottage near the forest, surrounded by herbs and charms meant to ward off evil. "The river won't give him back," Miriam said gravely when Lena explained her dream. "But there may be a way to find his soul." "What do I have to do?" Lena asked, desperation in her eyes. "You must enter the river at midnight, when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest," Miriam said. "But beware, once you're in, the river will try to claim you too. You must not listen to its whispers, no matter what you hear." That night, Lena stood at the river's edge, clutching a charm Miriam had given her, a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. The air was cold, and the forest around her was eerily quiet. Summoning her courage, she stepped into the water. The cold was bone deep, But she kept moving, wading further until the water reached her waist. The whispers began almost immediately, faint and insistent. They grew louder with each step, forming words that sounded like Ethan's voice. "Help me, Lena!" She squeezed the pendant tightly, forcing herself to ignore the voice. Suddenly, the current shifted, pulling her deeper into the river's center. She felt unseen hands grasping at her legs, but she kept moving forward. In the distance, she saw a faint glow beneath the water's surface. A figure trapped in the depths. It was Ethan. Without hesitation, Lena dove beneath the surface, swimming toward the glowing figure. As she reached out, the river's grip tightened around her, but she held onto Ethan's hand and pulled with all her strength. A blinding light erupted from the river, and Lena felt herself being thrown back onto the shore. Gasping for breath, she looked around and saw Ethan lying beside her, unconscious but alive. The villagers were stunned when Lena brought Ethan back. Though he was weak and shaken, he eventually recovered, remembering little of what had happened. Word spread that the river's curse had been broken, thanks to Lena's bravery. From that day on, the murk water flowed clearer, its dark reputation fading into memory. Though the villagers still treated it with respect, they no longer feared it. And Lena, hailed as a hero, knew that some forces, no matter how dark, could be overcome by courage and love. But late at night, when the moonlight hit the river just right, some swore they still heard faint whispers on the wind. A reminder that the river never truly forgets,